He sat across from me at the kitchen table, 42 years old, arms crossed, eyes fixed somewhere slightly to the left of his mother's face, not meeting her eyes, just close enough to pretend he was paying attention. His mother, Margaret, was talking. She'd driven an hour and 40 minutes to see him. She'd brought food. She'd asked about his work, his life, his kids. And he answered in the way that's harder to explain than silence itself, present in body, somewhere else entirely, in every other way. Short answers, phone face up on the table, a sigh when she asked a follow-up question. And then she said something small, something about his daughter's school play, and he looked up finally and said, "Mum, I've got a lot going on right now." That was it. She drove home an hour and 40 minutes. She told me later she cried the whole way, and what she said to me in that session has stayed with me for years. "Dr. Smith, he loves me. I know he does. So why does being around him make me feel like I'm in the way?" That question, that specific question, I've heard versions of it hundreds of times, and the answer, the real one, is something almost nobody says out loud. What you're going to understand by the end of this video is why a cold, distant son behaves exactly the way he does, and why everything you've probably tried to fix it has made it worse. And I'm going to give you one rule, a single, specific rule that when applied consistently changes the dynamic in a way that no conversation, no confrontation, and no amount of patience ever has. This isn't about making your son feel guilty. It's about understanding what he's actually responding to and giving him something different to respond to. Stay with me through the end. Every section of this matters. I've spent over 20 years working with families where the relationship between a mother and an adult son has broken down, not dramatically, not with a single catastrophic event, but slowly, through accumulated distance, through small moments that each seemed manageable on their own, but that, added together, created something that felt insurmountable. The mothers who come to see me are not neglectful women. They are not difficult women. They are women who loved their sons attentively, often sacrificially, and who now find themselves on the other side of a wall they didn't build and don't understand. The sons, in most cases, are not cruel men. They are not men who decided consciously to pull away. Something happened, something psychological, something that was never named or addressed, and the distance became the default. What I've learned across hundreds of cases is this. When a mother experiences her adult son as cold or distant, the behavior has a specific psychological function. It's not random. It's not just personality. And it's not fixed. But understanding what that function is requires looking at something most people don't want to look at. What he learned from you, from the relationship, from years of interacting in a particular way, about what closeness costs him. Margaret's son was named Daniel. When I first asked her to describe their relationship, she used the word close 3 times in the first 2 minutes. She said they used to talk every week. She said he used to call her when he was stressed. She said he used to ask her advice. "When did that change?" I asked. She thought about it for a long time. "Gradually," she said, "and then all at once." That answer is almost universal among the mothers I see in this situation. The distance doesn't arrive in a single moment. It accumulates. A call that doesn't get returned. A visit that gets cut short. A conversation that stays on the surface no matter how many times she tries to go deeper. And somewhere in that accumulation, the mother starts adapting. She stops asking certain questions because she notices they make him uncomfortable. She stops sharing certain things about herself because she's learned he doesn't really engage with them. She starts managing the interaction, shortening it, lightening it, making it easier for him to avoid the discomfort of the distance. And this is the part that most people miss entirely. That adaptation, that careful, loving, well-intentioned adjustment she makes to protect the relationship is the very thing that teaches the son the distance is free. When she stops asking the questions that make him uncomfortable, he learns that discomfort has no cost. When she shortens the visit so he doesn't feel pressured, he learns that his disengagement works. When she calls and says, "I just wanted to hear your voice. Don't worry, I won't keep you long," what he hears at a level far below conscious thought is that his presence has no particular value she's willing to insist on. She's been working so hard to keep the relationship that she accidentally taught him. It requires no work from him at all. Margaret stared at me when I said that. She said, "But I was doing it because I didn't want to push him away." I told her, "I know, and I know it came from love. But the effect was the opposite of what you intended." The emotional withdrawal hadn't happened to her. She had, without knowing it, participated in building it. And that realization, as brutal as it sounds, is actually the beginning of everything. Because what can be learned can be unlearned. What one set of behaviors created, a different set of behaviors can change. But first, she had to understand what was driving his withdrawal at the psychological level. And that's where the picture gets more complicated. I need to explain something that took me years of clinical work to fully understand, because it runs completely counter to what feels intuitively true when you're inside this kind of relationship. Cold, distant behavior in an adult son is almost never about love. Most of these men love their mothers. That's not the issue. The issue is what intimacy with their mother has come to feel like to them internally, and why their nervous system has learnt to treat it as something to manage rather than something to move toward. There are 3 patterns I see repeatedly. They're not mutually exclusive. Many sons carry elements of all 3. The first is what I call the emotional creditor pattern. This son, at some point in his development, began to experience emotional interactions with his mother as transactions where he always ends up owing something. Not because his mother intended this, but because her emotional needs, her worry, her loneliness, her desire for closeness were communicated in a way that made him feel responsible for managing them. Every phone call that ended with her sounding sad, every visit that ended with her looking hurt, every time he sensed her disappointment when he couldn't give her what she needed, he filed that away. And his nervous system eventually decided proximity means debt. So he manages the proximity, he keeps it controlled, he keeps it short, he keeps it on the surface where the debt can't accumulate. The second pattern is what I call the enmeshment hangover. This son grew up in a home where emotional boundaries between mother and child were blurred, not in any dramatic or abusive way, but where he felt responsible for his mother's emotional state, where her happiness was somehow connected to his choices, where being a good son meant keeping her emotionally comfortable. As an adult, he feels that pull acutely whenever he gets close. Closeness with her, to his nervous system, means losing himself. So he maintains the distance as a form of self-protection. He's not rejecting her. He's protecting a boundary that was never clearly drawn when it should have been. The third pattern is simpler but no less painful. The son who learnt through years of interaction that his mother doesn't actually see him. She sees the role he plays. She sees the son she needs him to be. And because he has never felt fully seen in that relationship, never felt that she was curious about who he actually is, as opposed to who she hoped he would be, he stopped trying to show her. The distance is a form of giving up. And giving up is less painful than the repeated experience of being invisible. Now, here is what makes this complicated. In all 3 patterns, the mother's instinctive response, trying harder, reaching out more, being more emotionally open and available, makes the problem worse. It increases the pressure the son feels, it confirms the patterns his nervous system has been tracking, and it gives him more reason to manage the distance rather than close it. The thing that actually works is something that feels deeply counterintuitive, almost threatening the first time I describe it. Let me tell you what happened when I explained all of this to Margaret. She listened carefully. She's a thoughtful woman. And when I finished, she sat very still for a moment, and then she said, "So, I've been making it worse." And I said, "You've been responding with love to a problem that doesn't respond to love in the way you've been applying it." She asked me what she should do differently. And I told her about the one rule, the rule that changes the entire structure of the dynamic. The rule that gives a cold, distant son something new to respond to, something his nervous system hasn't encountered in this relationship before. The rule is this: stop being available in all the ways he hasn't earned and become deeply, genuinely present in your own life. Let me explain exactly what that means, because the way it's usually misunderstood is as emotional punishment, withdrawal, playing games. That's not it. That's not even close to it. What most mothers of distant sons have done with love, with good intentions, is made themselves constantly accessible to their sons at a level that has no ceiling and no floor. Anytime he calls, they're available. Anytime he needs something, they're there. Anytime there's a family event, they arrange themselves around his schedule and his comfort. Their own lives, their friendships, their interests, their needs, their desires have been secondarily organized around the hope of connection with him. And here is what that communicates to his nervous system. She has nowhere else to be. Her presence costs her nothing to give. And therefore, not consciously, not cruelly, but mechanically, the way the brain always responds to availability, it is worth nothing to prioritize. We only value access to what we perceive we could lose. This is not a manipulation principle. It's one of the most replicated findings in attachment research. People, all people, not just sons, all people respond to the actual conditions of a relationship, not to the emotional declarations made within it. You can tell someone they matter to you every day, but if your behavior communicates that you will always be there regardless of how they treat the relationship, their behavior will reflect the actual terms, not the words. So when I say stop being available in all the ways he hasn't earned, what I mean specifically is this: stop cancelling your plans when he suddenly has time. Stop waiting for a call that may or may not come. Stop rearranging your life to be convenient for someone who hasn't been arranging his life to include you. And then, and this is the part that actually does the work, fill that space with your own life. Genuinely, completely, with intention. This is where I have to tell you about what happened with Margaret. Because she was skeptical. She said, "That sounds like I'm supposed to pretend I don't care." And I said to her, "That's exactly the wrong frame. It's not pretending you don't care. It's caring about yourself with the same sincerity that you've been caring about him." Margaret took 3 weeks to make one change, just one. She'd had a standing Tuesday lunch with a friend. She'd been cancelling regularly for months. Whenever Daniel called on Tuesday mornings to say he might stop by, she'd cancel the lunch and wait. He came about 1 in 4 times. She stopped cancelling the lunch. The first Tuesday she went, Daniel called while she was out. She didn't see the call until 2 hours later. She called him back. He said, "Oh, hey, no worries, I'll try another time," and hung up. She told me she sat in her car in the parking lot for 15 minutes afterwards, heart pounding, convinced she'd done something terrible. She hadn't done anything terrible, she'd done something different. The second week she went to the lunch again. He didn't call. The third week, he called on a Wednesday, not a Tuesday, a Wednesday, and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee that weekend. She checked her calendar, genuinely, because she had actually scheduled something Saturday morning. She told him Saturday morning didn't work for her, but Saturday afternoon did. He said, "Yeah, okay, Saturday afternoon." She told me about that conversation with the particular quality of surprise that comes when something works and you didn't quite believe it would. He didn't even hesitate. She said, he just said, "Okay." I explained to her what had happened. His brain had received new information. The information was, she has a life that requires navigation. Reaching her requires effort. Scheduling time with her involves her actual availability, not just his convenience. That information at the level of attachment dynamics is profound because it changes the value calculation his nervous system makes about her presence. But I need to be honest about what this looks like across cases, because I've seen this work in ways that are genuinely moving, and I've seen it be more complicated than that. In roughly half the cases where a mother applies this rule consistently over a 3 to 6 month period, the relationship shifts in a meaningful way. The son initiates contact more. The quality of that contact changes. There's more actual engagement, more curiosity from him, more of what the mother has been missing for years. The distance doesn't disappear overnight, but the direction reverses. That's what happened with Margaret and Daniel. By the 4th month, he was calling her, not because he needed something logistical, but just to talk. The first time it happened, she almost didn't recognize what it was. In about 30% of cases, the improvement is partial. The son reaches out more, but the depth the mother is hoping for doesn't fully arrive. The relationship stabilizes at something more mutual, less one-sided, but not the warmth she wants. That's still worth something. A relationship that costs her less, that doesn't require her to continuously shrink herself, is genuinely better than what was there before, even if it's not everything. And in some cases, I've seen this enough times that I won't pretend it doesn't happen, the son pulls back further. The change in his mother's availability reveals something about the relationship that was already there but invisible, that the connection was structured around her compliance. And when the compliance changes, there isn't much structure left. I had a patient, Sarah, 63 years old, whose son Michael, 38, responded to her applying this rule by gradually reducing contact to near zero over about 5 months. She came to me in those months asking if she'd made a terrible mistake. I told her what I tell everyone in that situation. If a son only maintains a relationship with his mother when she remains completely available on his terms and requires nothing from the relationship herself, that was not a connection. It was an arrangement. And the arrangement was working for one person. I want to go deeper into the mechanism, because understanding why this works is what makes it sustainable. Without the understanding, it just feels like a strategy. And strategies collapse under emotional pressure. Understanding holds. When an adult son has developed a pattern of emotional distance from his mother, his brain is running a particular program. That program says, closeness with her costs me something I don't want to pay. What specifically does it cost? Depends on the pattern. For the emotional creditor son, closeness costs him the feeling that he's responsible for her well-being. For the enmeshment hangover son, closeness costs him his sense of a separate self. For the invisible son, the one who learned she doesn't really see him, closeness costs him repeated exposure to that particular loneliness. When his mother changes, when she becomes genuinely absorbed in her own life, when she stops organizing herself around the hope of his attention, when she has things going on that matter to her independently of him, something shifts in what closeness costs. Because now closeness with her doesn't require him to manage her emotional state. She seems to have that handled. Closeness with her doesn't threaten his sense of self, because she clearly has her own self she's inhabiting fully. And closeness with her starts to offer something it hasn't offered in a long time. The experience of a person who is interesting, who is alive, who has a perspective on life that has nothing to do with waiting for him. I've had sons tell me in individual sessions, not with their mothers, that the shift in their mother changed how they experienced her. One man, 41 years old, said, "She used to feel like something I had to take care of, and I didn't want to take care of her. I felt guilty that I didn't want to. Now she feels like, I don't know like a person, I want to know." He wasn't describing a change in his love for her. His love had always been there. He was describing a change in what the relationship felt like to his nervous system, from obligation to choice. That shift from obligation to choice is everything. And here is what makes it so hard to create deliberately, because the natural impulse of a loving mother who senses her son pulling away is to move toward him, to reach out more, to make herself more emotionally available, to communicate with everything she does that she's here, she loves him, she's not going anywhere. And all of that communication, delivered through constant availability, creates exactly the conditions that make his withdrawal worse. The rule building a full, genuine, engaged life of your own is not about teaching him a lesson. It's not about making a point. It's about becoming genuinely a person whose presence he has to choose to seek, rather than a presence that asks nothing of him precisely because it has nowhere else to be. There's a line I come back to regularly in my work with families. We only pursue access to things we experience as having their own existence, independent of our pursuit. A mother who has her own life, who is absorbed in her work, her friendships, her interests, her own growth, has an existence independent of her son's pursuit. She's there when he comes. But she's also there when he doesn't come. And the version of her that's there when he doesn't come is rich, full, engaged. His nervous system processes that, and the processing changes behavior. Now I need to talk about how this goes wrong, because there are specific ways of applying this principle that undermine it completely. The first error is performing the change rather than embodying it. I've worked with mothers who hear this principle and decide to be busy. They fill their calendar. They don't pick up the phone on the first ring. They let text sit for a while before responding. But they're not actually building a life, they're staging one. And sons, the way all people pick up on inauthenticity in close relationships, sense the performance. It doesn't land as a mother who has a full life, it lands as a mother who is doing something at him. And the response to that is different, usually warmer initially, and then more confused and distant when the staging becomes apparent. The change has to be real. It doesn't work as theatre. Margaret told me in one of our middle sessions that she'd started a watercolour class she'd been thinking about for 11 years. She said she felt foolish the first week. She said she was clearly the worst person in the room. She also said she'd gone to 3 sessions now, and she caught herself thinking about colour mixing while making dinner, which hadn't happened with anything in longer than she could remember. That's what I mean. Genuine engagement, something that takes her attention because it merits it, not because she's managing a strategy. The second error is applying the principle inconsistently. Every time a mother applies the rule and then reverts, cancels her plans when he calls, rearranges her weekend to accommodate him, goes back to the old patterns of full and unconditional availability. She teaches him that the new system is temporary, that if he waits long enough or is warm enough, she'll return to the arrangement where nothing is required of him. The research on intermittent reinforcement is very clear. Inconsistent responses to behavior are harder to extinguish than consistent ones. Every time she reverts, she makes the next attempt to hold the boundary harder for herself and less credible to him. I saw this with a mother named Claire, 61, whose son had started showing signs of re-engagement after about 6 weeks of her consistently having plans and not adjusting them around his unpredictable availability. He'd called 3 times in 1 week, the most contact in years. She was encouraged. Then his wife called to say they'd had a difficult month and things were hard, and Claire, because she loved him, because that's what mothers do, cleared her entire schedule and made herself completely available for 2 weeks. And he stopped calling. It wasn't punitive on his part. He wasn't testing her. His nervous system simply received familiar information. She's available on demand again, and reverted to familiar behavior. She had to start over, and starting over from a period of progress is harder than starting from zero. The third error is delivering the change with resentment rather than genuine investment. Some mothers who have been in painful, one-sided dynamics for years hear this principle and feel a surge of something close to relief and something close to anger simultaneously. Finally, they think, finally, I get to stop making myself small. That's understandable. But if the investment in her own life comes from a place of, now you'll see, if there's a message underneath the watercolour classes and the lunches with friends that's directed at him, designed to make him feel what she's felt, it doesn't work. He'll feel the message, and the message will push him away. The shift has to come from a genuine reckoning with her own life, with who she is outside of being his mother, with what she wants, what interests her, what she's been postponing. The motivation is her own wholeness, not his behavior change. His behavior change, when it comes, is a byproduct, a result, not the goal. There's something I want to describe carefully because it matters more than anything else I've said today. When a mother genuinely applies this principle, when she builds her own life, not as a strategy, but as an act of self-recognition, something changes in her that has nothing to do with her son's behavior. She stops waiting. And waiting, it turns out, is one of the most damaging states she's been living in without fully naming it. The constant low-level vigilance of a mother whose primary emotional orientation is toward the question of whether her son will call, will come, will open up this time. That vigilance is exhausting in a way that becomes invisible over time because it becomes constant. When she stops waiting, when Tuesday lunches happen, whether or not he calls, when her weekends have their own shape and texture and she's no longer holding them open like empty containers, she gets something back that's hard to name and unmistakable once it's there. Margaret described it in our 6th session. She said, "I realized I'd stopped being a full person. I'd narrowed myself down to just the part that was hoping for something from him. And I didn't know how much of me had gone missing until something came back." She went to Portugal that autumn, a 10-day trip she'd been talking about for years and never taken. She called me from Lisbon, which she'd never done before. She said the light there was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Daniel called her 4 times during that trip, just to talk. She came back from Portugal different, and not primarily because of the calls, because of who she'd been in those 10 days, someone whose life was happening fully, with or without him in it. And here's the truth I want you to hold. That version of her, the one who exists fully, the one who has places to be and things that interest her and a life she's genuinely inside of, is the version of his mother that his nervous system will move toward. People pursue presence, not need. They move toward those who exist richly on their own. They pull back, eventually, from those whose existence centers too heavily on the hope of connection. She spent years trying to get closer to him by making herself more available. What reached him was her becoming, unapologetically, someone. Let me bring this back to where it ends, because I think the realistic picture matters more than the hopeful one. Daniel and Margaret now speak about twice a week. He came to see her last spring and stayed 3 days, the first time in 7 years he'd stayed overnight. At some point during those 3 days, he said to her, "Mum, you seem different. What changed?" She told him the truth. She said she'd decided to stop waiting for things and start doing them. He sat with that for a moment and then said, "I think I was counting on you waiting." And then neither of them said anything else for a while because that was enough. Not every story ends that way. I want to be direct about that. The psychological reality is that a son who has deeply entrenched patterns of distance or who has other significant factors at play in his life, his own relational history, his own attachment wounds, his own therapeutic work left undone, may not respond even when his mother makes every change correctly. What will happen in every case is that she will be better. Her life will be fuller. She'll stop organizing herself around the hope of something that may or may not materialize. And she'll discover, usually to her own considerable surprise, that a life she stopped shrinking is a life worth living for its own sake. The relationship with a distant son is one kind of pain, but the relationship with herself, the one she's been postponing to manage his distance, that's a different pain, quieter and more total, and it's one she has more power over than she realized. Sarah, whose son Michael pulled away, came to me 18 months after we finished our work together. She looked different. She'd started writing something she'd done in her 20s and abandoned. She'd joined a walking group. She had 2 friends she saw every week, who she described, with a small amount of wonder in her voice, as people who were genuinely interested in who she was. She said, "I lost a relationship that was hurting me. I don't know yet if Michael will ever come back to it differently, but I found out I had a life I wasn't living, and I started living it. That's also a result. A harder result. A real one." The pattern behind every case I've described today is the same. A mother's presence becomes valuable when it has its own existence, when it doesn't ask to be accepted, when it doesn't reorganize itself around whether he shows up, when it's clearly, evidently, a full life regardless of the quality of his participation in it. People move toward what exists. They take for granted what simply waits. This is not about loving him less. It has nothing to do with loving him less. It's about loving yourself enough to have a life that doesn't depend on him choosing to be in it fully. And that life, that genuine, inhabited, non-waiting life, is the most honest thing you can offer him. Because what you're showing him when you live it is that closeness to you is worth something, that your time has weight, that showing up for you means arriving somewhere real. If this reached something true in you today, comment the word presence below, just that word. It'll tell me this is landing with the people who need it. And if you know a mother who's been in this particular kind of pain, who loves a son she can't reach and has been making herself smaller for years, try and share this with her. Because the thing she needs to hear first is that it has a name and a mechanism and a direction out. The one rule: stop waiting, build the life, and trust that a person worth reaching will find their way to someone who exists. Yeah,